You can't trust the word of any American leader at this point. That's not me saying it. That's one of the world's leading political scientists, John Mearsheimer, dropping a truth bomb that should terrify every American. And he's not just talking about Trump, he's talking about Biden, Obama, Bush, the entire American foreign policy establishment. The most powerful nation on earth has become the least trustworthy. How did we get here? The story starts at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union made what Mearsheimer calls the great mistake of trusting America's word. Soviet leaders were verbally promised, that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. No written agreement, no legal document, just America's word. And what happened? The Clinton administration came along and expanded NATO anyway. Then Bush pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to join. The Russians learned a brutal lesson. American promises mean nothing without them being written down. And even then, the United States can violate written agreements too. Fast forward to 2025 and nothing has changed. Trump comes into office promising to end the war in Ukraine immediately. Did he? No. He promised peace through strength in the Middle East. What happened? There's no real ceasefire in Gaza, just Israel continuing operations while Trump claims victory. He said he'd get tough with China on tariffs. He was forced to back down. The Chinese outmaneuvered him completely. This is the pattern we're seeing across the board. Big promises, zero delivery, and allies who don't trust us anymore. Here's where it gets really interesting. Even Ukraine's Zelensky doesn't trust American promises. He's demanding security guarantees that go through Congress, not just something on paper from the president. Why? Because he remembers the 1994 Budapest Memorandum where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances. Those assurances proved worthless when Russia invaded. Zelensky knows that presidential promises evaporate the moment a new administration takes office. He wants something more permanent, which is exactly what the Russians are demanding too. Think about what this means. The United States has positioned itself as the guarantor of global security for 8 decades. But now, both our enemies and our friends are saying the same thing. We don't believe you anymore. Russia wants everything in writing because they know American verbal commitments are worthless. Ukraine wants congressional approval because they know presidential promises disappear. Our European allies are scrambling to build their own defense capabilities because they can't rely on American protection. Even India, which we've spent 25 years courting as a strategic partner, is backing away because Trump's policies have poisoned the relationship. Mearsheimer points out something crucial here. When you look at Trump's actual foreign policy record in 2025, it's abysmal. He couldn't force China to accept his tariff demands. He couldn't shut down the war in Ukraine as promised. He claims to have created peace in Gaza, but there's no ceasefire from Israel's perspective. They're still conducting military operations. He promised to restore American deterrence, but what has he actually restored? Nothing. If anything, he's weakened it. This trust deficit isn't just about hurt feelings or diplomatic awkwardness. It has real strategic consequences. Take the whole NATO expansion issue that started this mess. The Russians didn't want NATO on their border. That was their red line, their existential security concern. But instead of getting that in writing, they trusted America's word. When that word proved meaningless and NATO expanded anyway, it set the stage for the Ukraine conflict we're seeing today. 2022 didn't come out of nowhere. It came from decades of broken American promises. Here's the part that should worry every American. When you can't be trusted, you can't negotiate. And when you can't negotiate, conflicts get settled on the battlefield. That's exactly what Mearsheimer says is happening in Ukraine right now. All these peace talks, all these negotiation attempts, all this diplomatic theater, it's kabuki theater, it's not serious. Why? Because the Russians don't trust Trump or any American negotiator to actually deliver on whatever deal gets made. They've been burned too many times. They know the only way to secure their objectives is through military force because American diplomacy is unreliable. The pattern extends beyond Russia. Look at what's happening with our supposed peace through strength doctrine. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth tweeted about how after years of Biden making America weak and woke, Trump is reestablishing deterrence through military action. But what military actions are we talking about? Pinpricks in Somalia. Failed operations in Nigeria, bombing some boats in the Caribbean, a one-day strike on Iran that Trump declared victory for, but now we're talking about attacking them again because apparently we didn't achieve victory. These aren't demonstrations of strength, they're demonstrations of confusion and inconsistency. The Venezuela situation perfectly illustrates the problem. Trump has had a massive armada, and we're talking about the biggest naval deployment in South America's history sitting in the Caribbean since August 2025. The stated goal was regime change in Venezuela. Trump wanted Maduro gone. But after months of having all this firepower positioned there, what has the United States actually done? We've blown up some fishing boats. We've seized a couple of oil tankers. We've conducted strikes that killed civilians but didn't change the strategic situation at all. Maduro is still in power. The Armada hasn't been used for its intended purpose. Why? Because there's no clear strategy for how to achieve the desired end state. This is what happens when you can't be trusted to follow through on your commitments. You can't build coalitions. You can't make credible threats. You can't negotiate settlements. Everything becomes either empty posturing or chaotic military action without clear objectives. And the rest of the world notices. They adjust their behavior accordingly. They stop taking American promises seriously. They start building alternative power structures that don't depend on American reliability. The Europeans are learning this lesson the hard way right now. For decades, they relied on American security guarantees through NATO. They built their entire defense posture around the assumption that America would always have their back. But Trump's second administration has made it crystal clear that this assumption is no longer valid. The 2025 national security strategy essentially tells Europe to stand on its own feet, to take responsibility for its own defense. The burden of supporting Ukraine has been shifted from American shoulders to European shoulders. And guess what? The Europeans are discovering they can't handle it. They tried to steal Russian frozen assets to fund Ukraine. They couldn't get consensus. They're borrowing money at their own expense to keep Ukraine afloat. Their economies are suffering, and they're realizing that American security guarantees were always contingent, always temporary, always subject to change based on whoever occupies the White House. Let's talk about what peace through strength actually means versus what Trump claims it means, because there's a massive gap between rhetoric and reality. Trump's team loves this phrase. Secretary Hegseth uses it constantly. But when you examine the military actions the United States took in 2025, the picture looks nothing like strength. It looks like strategic confusion wrapped in tactical aggression. Military Times documented every use of force in Trump's first year. The list is stunning. Somalia in February, Iraq, Yemen multiple times, Iran, the big one Trump claimed as victory, Nigeria, the Caribbean Sea, multiple strikes in multiple theaters with no coherent strategic objective. Messimer asks the critical question, is this demonstrating peace through strength or undermining peace? Real strength isn't about how many targets you hit, it's about achieving strategic objectives. And by that measure, Trump's actions have been failures. Take Iran as the clearest example. Trump launched a major one-day attack, massive strike, hit nuclear facilities and missile sites. Trump declared total victory. But Iran's president came out days later and said they consider themselves almost at war with the West. They're not capitulating, they're not negotiating, they're rebuilding missile capabilities. They've dispersed offensive weapons throughout the country. They've reportedly restored everything lost in the June strike and gone beyond it. So if the goal was to deter Iran or force negotiations, the strike failed completely. This is the pattern across all of Trump's military actions. They're reactive, not strategic. Look at the how this in Yemen. Trump said Biden hadn't been tough enough. He promised to finish them off quickly. After a month and 500 million, Trump quit. He admitted the Houthis were tougher than expected and we couldn't defeat them. That's not strength. That's backing into a corner through overconfident promises. The Venezuela situation is even more revealing. Trump deployed 15,000 per SNL's Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, multiple destroyers, F-35 fighters, special operations forces. It's the largest military buildup in the region in decades. Stated objective regime change. Force Maduro out. But after months of having all this military power positioned there, what's been accomplished? We've seized some oil tankers. We've sunk fishing boats allegedly carrying drugs. We've killed dozens of civilians. But Maduro is still in power. If anything, these actions strengthened his position domestically. Mershimer makes a brutal point. Most of these operations are pinpricks. They're not successful at achieving stated objectives. The Venezuela Armada hasn't led to regime change. The Nigeria strike was meaningless strategically. The Iran strike didn't deter Iran. When you step back, they don't add up to coherent strategy. They add up to activity without purpose. Now, compare this to how other powers operate. Look at Russia's approach in Ukraine. They have clear strategic objectives: secure the Donbass, prevent NATO expansion, establish Ukrainian neutrality. They have coherent strategy. Grind down Ukrainian forces through superior artillery and manpower. Wait for Western support to wane. Settle on favorable terms. They have patience and resources to execute over years. That's strategic thinking. That's real strength. Defining objectives clearly and pursuing them consistently despite setbacks. Compare that to the American approach. What's our strategic objective in Ukraine? It keeps changing. First defending Ukraine's sovereignty, then weakening Russia, then supporting Ukraine as long as it takes. Now, Trump wants to end it quickly, but on what terms? Nobody knows. There's no coherent American strategy. We're just reacting, throwing money and weapons at the problem, hoping something good happens. That's not strategy. That's strategic drift disguised as support. Or look at China's approach to Taiwan. Clear objective: reunify Taiwan with the mainland. Long-term strategy: build overwhelming military capabilities, conduct regular exercises demonstrating blockade ability, wait for the right moment when American commitment wavers. They're patient, consistent, building needed capabilities. That's strategic thinking. Whether you agree with their goals or not, they're pursuing them coherently. What's the American strategy for Taiwan? Supposedly maintain status quo. Taiwan neither declares independence nor gets absorbed. But what are we actually doing? Selling Taiwan $11 billion in weapons, making statements about defending Taiwan if China attacks, but also trying to improve China relations, negotiate trade deals, avoid confrontation. These objectives contradict each other. You can't simultaneously prepare Taiwan to fight China and expect Chinese cooperation. We're creating a situation where conflict becomes more likely, not less. The fundamental problem. American foreign policy has become untethered from strategic thinking. We make moves that feel good in the moment. Bomb this target, sanction that country, sell weapons to this ally without thinking through second and third order effects. We don't ask what's our ultimate objective, what's our theory of victory, what resources will we commit, what are the risks? These are questions serious strategists ask. But American foreign policy in 2025 is driven by politics, not strategy. Take deterrence that Heggs keeps discussing. Real deterrence means making credible threats that adversaries believe you'll follow through on. But how can you establish credible deterrence when you've spent decades breaking promises? Russians don't believe American threats because we failed to enforce red lines in Syria. Iranians don't believe threats because Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal. Chinese don't believe threats because we've said Taiwan matters but done nothing when China increases pressure. Deterrence requires credibility. Credibility requires consistency and follow-through. America has neither. Here's what's really happening. The Trump administration confuses activity with achievement. They conduct lots of military operations and claim that proves American strength is back. But strength isn't measured by how many targets you hit. It's measured by whether you achieve strategic objectives. And by that measure, American foreign policy is failing across the board. We're not deterring adversaries. We're not reassuring allies. We're not achieving stated goals in any theater. We're creating chaos and calling it strength. The tragedy is that real American strength is being squandered. We still have the most powerful military, the largest economy, technological advantages over competitors, but we're wasting these through incoherent strategy and broken trust. If we could articulate clear objectives, build genuine coalitions, and follow through on commitments, we could achieve significant things. Instead, we're burning through resources, credibility, and goodwill for no lasting strategic gain. And that brings us to the one place where this pattern becomes most obvious and most dangerous, Ukraine. Let's talk about Ukraine because this is where American untrustworthiness becomes most visible. The reality is brutal. Ukraine is losing, negotiations are theater, and nobody trusts anyone. Russia controls 20% of Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian forces are exhausted after 4 years. Western aid is declining. Trump promised to end this war immediately in January 2025. He didn't. Why? Because there's zero trust between parties. Trump's administration created a 28-point peace plan. Russia said it's a starting point but has issues. Ukraine rejected parts and made their own 20-point plan. Russia won't accept that on NATO membership, territorial control, security guarantees. The sides are miles apart. Putin made this clear recently. His interest in negotiations is near zero. Either Ukraine agrees to Russian terms from June 14, 2024, or Russia takes what they want by force. Those terms: demilitarization, denazification, neutrality, no NATO, and control of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Karen, and Crimea. These are minimum demands, not negotiating positions. Zelensky's position is incompatible. 80% of Ukrainians support peace, but 85% oppose withdrawing from the Donbass. Ukrainian forces still hold fortress cities in northern Donetsk. Withdrawing means giving up strategic terrain for nothing. Marimer's response is brutal. Russia will take all of Donetsk anyway. The question is whether Ukraine loses it through negotiation now or military defeat later. Rationally, Ukraine should cut a deal now, but they can't. A colleague who visited Kyiv reported that Zelensky politically cannot make necessary concessions. If he gives up the Donbass through negotiation, he's finished. Ukrainian elites think it's easier if they lose territory militarily. Then Zelensky can say they fought to the end. This is insane strategically, but makes sense politically, and it shows why negotiations are kabuki theater. Ukraine can't agree to Russian demands due to politics. Russia won't accept less because they have military momentum and don't trust Western guarantees. There's talk of 15-year guarantees. Ukraine wants 50 years, but Russia will never accept American security guarantees to Ukraine. The entire war is about preventing NATO guarantees that put American military power on Russia's border. Even Zelensky doesn't trust American promises. He wants guarantees through Congress, not presidential commitments. He learned from the Budapest Memorandum, but Congress can't bind future Congresses either. The result? This war will be settled on the battlefield exactly as Meshamer predicted. All negotiation is just PR. Meanwhile, Trump shifted the burden of supporting Ukraine to Europe. Europeans provide money, weapons support, but they can't afford it. They tried confiscating Russian frozen assets, failed. Now they're borrowing money to give Ukraine, claiming Russia will repay through reparations, but Russia isn't losing. Economic damage to Europe is staggering. Germany lost nuclear power, then lost cheap Russian gas. Industrial output fell 5%. Now they're borrowing billions for Ukraine while their economies crater. This is unsustainable. European publics will eventually demand leaders stop throwing money at a losing war. Support is already weakening in Hungary, Slovakia, even Germany and France. When the war ends with Russian victory, recriminations will be intense. But the reality, Western strategy failed. Russia will control more Ukrainian territory than before and will have prevented Ukraine from joining NATO, their primary objective. While everyone watches Ukraine, a bigger threat is developing. War with China over Taiwan. Unlike Ukraine, this could go nuclear. Unlike Ukraine, it's direct conflict between nuclear superpowers, and the U.S. might not have capacity to prevail. The U.S. just approved $1 billion in arms for Taiwan. The largest package ever. Higher systems of ATAMS missiles, howitzers, javelins, drones, advanced software. These are offensive capabilities, same weapons we gave Ukraine. China's response was furious. They said the sale violates the One China principle and undermines stability. Taiwan is their core interest and first red line. They warned no one should underestimate their will to defend sovereignty. China just completed their third large-scale drill, rehearsing a Taiwan blockade. They simulated strikes on ports and energy facilities. They're building real capabilities to execute this. Taiwan's President Lai has been more pro-independence. He announced $40 billion in defense spending through 2033. He warns China aims to seize Taiwan by 2027. This increases tensions because China sees independence moves as justification for military action. Here's where it gets dangerous. Japan's prime minister said if China invades Taiwan, Japan would see it as survival threat. That means Japan would fight. For China, this is unacceptable. Taiwan is a domestic issue, and Japan intervening triggers World War II historical animosity. Now we have China wanting reunification, the US committed to preventing it, and Japan saying they'd fight. This is nuclear powers confronting over existential issues. How does this not lead to war? Could China conquer Taiwan if the US and Japan intervene? Mersheimer says probably not at acceptable cost. Invasion requires massive amphibious assault. American submarines would be waiting. Taiwan would launch missiles and drones. The invasion fleet would be devastated, but the US and Japan couldn't win either. We couldn't defeat China decisively. At best, we prevent China from taking Taiwan short term. Then what? Protracted war with no end. China rebuilds and tries again. Here's the nightmare. Both sides have nuclear weapons. We'd fight partially at sea where nuclear threshold is lower. The US would attack Chinese mainland command centers, missile sites. Many systems are dual use. In fog of war, it's impossible to tell if incoming missiles have nuclear warheads. The US attacks Chinese homeland, China attacks American bases in Japan. Both sides operate under pressure with limited information. The potential for miscalculation and nuclear escalation is enormous. This wouldn't be quick. It's long attrition war with mounting casualties. Industrial capacity matters. China has massive production capability for ships, missiles, equipment. The US does not. We let shipbuilding atrophy. We can't produce munitions at China's rate. We saw this in Ukraine. Imagine it facing China's industrial base. In long war, China has advantages sustaining their effort. They replace losses faster. They outlast us. And if we're losing, carriers sinking, bases destroyed, heavy casualties. What then? We've called Taiwan a vital interest. But if we're losing conventionally, do we escalate to nuclear? That's the nightmare nobody wants to think about. Mersheimer says in Taiwan war, the US would attack Chinese homeland. If we're hitting them with conventional weapons, what stops them hitting us? They can strike Guam, Hawaii, potentially continental US. And if they're facing defeat in a war they view as existential, what stops them using whatever means necessary? The strategic logic points to terrifying conclusion. War over Taiwan between US and China could plausibly go nuclear. Not because either side wants it, but because conflict dynamics. Homeland strikes, limited information, mounting casualties, no victory path could make nuclear escalation the least bad option. How do we avoid this? Mersheimer argues we must walk a fine line, deter China from attacking Taiwan, but don't encourage Taiwan to declare independence. Make clear to Taiwan if you move toward formal independence, you're on your own. The US won't fight China to defend independence declaration. This is the tightrope. Deter aggression without emboldening independence movements. Maintain enough capability to make invasion expensive, but make clear American support has limits. It requires sophisticated diplomacy and consistent messaging. Instead, what are we doing? Selling Taiwan $11 billion in weapons without clearly explaining what triggers American intervention. We're creating ambiguity where clarity is essential. Taiwan might interpret arms sales as green light for independence that increases risk of provoking China. Then we either back down, destroying credibility, or fight a war that could go nuclear. China's position is crystal clear. Taiwan is sacred territory that must be reunified. They'll use force if necessary, yet we keep taking actions, arms sales, diplomatic support, implied guarantees that move us closer to the scenario where China decides force is their only option. This is a security dilemma leading to war. We build up Taiwan to deter China. China interprets this as preparation to permanently separate Taiwan. They accelerate military buildup. We increase commitments. They become more aggressive. The spiral continues until someone miscalculates. Now, think about this. What happens if the US is simultaneously fighting Russia in Europe and China in Asia? What if we're trying to support Israel against Iran while managing these conflicts? We don't have the industrial capacity, the military resources, or the strategic focus to handle multiple great power conflicts simultaneously. Yet that's exactly the situation we're creating through incoherent foreign policy. So where does this leave us? With a credibility crisis that makes diplomacy impossible, military commitments we can't sustain, and potential flashpoints for nuclear war that we're stumbling toward while calling it strength. This isn't strength. It's strategic insanity wrapped in tough guy rhetoric, and the cost of learning this lesson might be measured in mushroom clouds, not diplomatic embarrassments.